Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. There was a lot of flooding in the United States during the first half of this year, which the New York Times of course blamed on global warming. They said warm air can carry more water than cold air. Gabriel Vecchi, a Princeton researcher, compares warmer air to a bigger bucket. It can carry more water from oceans and then dump that water on land. Well, that sounds very sciencey. Let's take a closer look at the claim and see if it's true. Let's see what the actual air temperatures were in the flooded regions. Here's a picture of flooding in Darlington, Wisconsin on March 14, 2019. You can see that there was flooding along this roadway and flooding in the downtown area. Now let's take a look at Wisconsin temperatures during that time. This map shows the temperature departure from normal for the United States from January 1st through the end of March 2019. The map was generated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the Department of Commerce. You can see that Wisconsin temperatures were far below normal, as they were across most of the United States. Now let's look at the same map from the period of March through May. We see the same thing. Wisconsin and the vast majority of the United States was well below normal temperature. The New York Times said that the flooding was caused by warm air holding more moisture. It's a lovely theory, except that the air was colder than normal. Precipitation falls when the air can't hold the moisture, not when it can. That's why we normally get precipitation when a cold front passes through. This is a graph of U.S. precipitation versus temperature going back to the year 1895. Across the x-axis is temperature increasing from left to right, and up the y-axis is precipitation increasing from bottom to top. You can see that the coolest years are also the wettest years, and the warmest years are also the driest. This shouldn't surprise anyone because drought and heat waves are associated together. Like in 1934, we had the worst drought and some of the worst heat waves in U.S. history. So the New York Times, as usual, didn't bother to do any actual fact-checking before they wrote their article. The real story is the exact opposite of what the New York Times claimed. The reality is that the warmest years tend to be dry and the coolest years tend to be wet. Now let's look at the real story of flooding instead of the fake story from the New York Times. We're going to spend the next few minutes discussing some of the basic principles of geology. This is the Grand Canyon in Arizona, where I study geology. You can see a cross-section of several thousand feet of sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is rock that was formed from sediments like sand, silt, or mud. The oldest rocks are at the bottom and the youngest rocks are at the top. The majority of these rocks were either formed underwater or adjacent to the water. If you think about that, that's pretty amazing. The top of the Grand Canyon is at 7,000 feet elevation. Does that mean that at one time sea level was 7,000 feet higher than it is now? Well, of course not. So let's take a look at how these thick layers of rock actually formed. Over long periods of time, rocks which are exposed to weather break down. They turn into things like boulders, sand, silt, and mud. Gravity then carries this weathered material down to lower elevations. This process of moving material from the left side of the diagram to the right side does a couple of things. It reduces the weight of Earth's crust on the left side of the diagram, and it increases the weight of Earth's crust on the right side of the diagram. Now let's zoom out for a minute and look at the bigger picture. This diagram shows Earth's crust in shades of brown, and it shows the Earth's mantle as red. You can see pretty clearly in this diagram that the surface of the mantle, shown in red, is not even. Let's examine now why that is. Earth's crust floats on top of the mantle. On the left side of the diagram, the crust is thicker and heavier than it is on the right side. The extra weight on the left side pushes the mantle down underneath it and depresses it. You can think of this as being like a giant iceberg, with most of the iceberg hidden under the surface of the water. Icebergs float in the ocean, and Earth's crust floats in the mantle. So if erosion removes material from the top of this mountain, it will weigh less. The lower weight would cause less depression of the mantle underneath it and actually cause the land to pop back up again. It's counterintuitive that as the land surface erodes, the rocks underneath it are actually going to rise. But it's the same reason why an ice cube sitting in a glass of water remains above the surface of the water even as the ice cube melts. A melting ice cube weighs less over time and thus pushes the water down less and less underneath it. Now let's zoom back in again on the other diagram. Over long periods of time, erosion is moving rock material from the left side of the diagram to the right side of the diagram. So now we have more weight on the right side of the diagram and less weight on the left side of the diagram. And if we go back and look at our picture of the mantle again, we can see what's going to happen. As erosion causes material to move from the mountains over towards the ocean, that's going to produce more weight of sediment over here on the right side of the diagram. And the increased weight of sediment is going to push the mantle underneath it down. That's going to actually cause the land to sink. So you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with flooding? This is a great geologic map of the United States made in the year 1873. Over here in this yellow is the lower Mississippi River. This yellow represents sedimentary rocks which were deposited by the Mississippi River. What happens is that material from the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains and other upland regions erodes away and then washes down into the Mississippi River. So every time we get a flood, rock material moves from the higher elevations down into the Mississippi River towards lower elevations. This causes the land in the Rocky Mountains and in the Appalachian Mountains to weigh less, and the land along the Mississippi River to weigh more. And all of the sediments along the Mississippi River is deposited during floods. Most of the eastern half of the United States was in fact created by millions and millions of floods. And each one of those floods made the river valleys heavier than they were before. This diagram is a cross-section of the Gulf of Mexico. You can see that there's very thick layers of sediment in the Gulf of Mexico which were brought down the Mississippi River and deposited there by floods. Floodwaters coming down the Mississippi River have over millions of years deposited more than 7 miles of sediment in the Gulf of Mexico. And each time a flood occurs, this mass of sediment gets heavier and then gets pushed down further and further into the mantle. And that's how we get thick layers of sedimentary rock like we see at the Grand Canyon. Obviously the rocks at the Grand Canyon are no longer underwater because of other tectonic processes which have pushed the land surface up. Now let's get to the key point. All of the lands along the river valleys in the eastern United States, like the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers, was deposited there by floods. These floods created very fertile soils, which is the reason why the farmers settled there in the first place. Flooding is not something new. There's been millions and millions of floods along the river valleys of the eastern United States. After millions of these floods occurred, scientific illiterates at the New York Times checked in and decided that floods were something new. But they're not new. Let's look at some of the worst flooding in U.S. history. The year 1913 brought a lot of incredibly severe weather to the United States. This map shows in blue regions which flooded along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers during the year 1913. The red dot shows some of the worst tornado outbreaks from March 1913, and the gray area shows regions which were hit very hard by storms during that month. The fires, floods, and tornadoes of March 1913 were described as the worst cataclysm in U.S. history. This is a great book written by Logan Marshall, who also wrote The Sinking of the Titanic. The true story of our national calamity by flood, fire, and tornado, the appalling loss of life, the terrible suffering of the homeless, the struggles for safety, the noble heroism of those who risk life to save loved ones, the unprecedented loss of property, resulting in the laying waste of flourishing cities and towns, how the whole nation joined in the work of relief. In this book, he described an unprecedented succession of tornadoes, floods, storms, and blizzards which in March 1913 devastated vast areas of territory in Ohio, Indiana, Nebraska, and a dozen other states, and which followed fast by the ravages of fire, famine, and disease. This picture shows flooding in upstate New York in March 1913, and this picture shows similar flooding in Ohio. Omaha, Nebraska was largely destroyed by a tornado that month, and this picture shows the aftermath of the tornado. Here's some newspaper headlines from that tornado. Western section of Omaha in ruins. More than 300 killed in big Omaha tornado. In Logan Marshall's book, he showed the path of the tornado moving all the way from Oregon up into New England. And this was the aftermath of the flooding in Ohio, which was occurring at the same time. Dead horses all over the streets. This is the front page of the Washington Post from March 27, 1913. Flood, flames, famine spread a pall of horror over cities of misery and suffering. 500,000 people in need of food, shelter, and protection from pestilence, but destruction of railroads retards relief. And here's the front page of the Harris Telegraph from the same day. Dayton at fire's mercy. Bitter cold adds horror. But the cold didn't last forever, and by June there was massive heat waves from Denver to Pittsburgh, and as far north as Lake Superior. Chicago was 102 degrees on July 3, 1913, and dozens of people were dying in the heat. The following week, on July 10, 1913, California set the world's record temperature of 134 degrees, which has never been matched again. And the heat wave continued all summer. From August 1st through September 7th, 1913, Nebraska was over 100 degrees every single day but one. And remember that Omaha was still recovering from a massive tornado which wiped out large sections of the city in March. And then if that wasn't bad enough, in December, Texas had some of the worst flooding in that state's history. The December 1913 floods along the Brazos River in Texas killed more than 150 people. This picture was taken at Richmond, Texas, where I purchased my first house 30 years ago. The Brazos River also had very bad flooding while I lived there. Now let's move forward to the 1920s. On March 19, 1925, the worst tornado in U.S. history killed more than 1,000 people in 6 states. There were more than 4,000 total casualties in those storms, and dozens of entire towns were wiped out. 2 years later, in 1927, brought the worst flooding in Vermont history along the Winooski River. In 1927 also brought the worst flooding in U.S. history to the Mississippi River. These floods lasted for more than 6 months and drove hundreds of thousands of people from their homes permanently. The year 1931 brought the worst floods in world history, with millions of people dead in China. And then 1936 brought horrific flooding to the eastern United States once again. This headline said, "All Eastern America under flood waters. President signs appeal as capital flooded, 100 cities and 14 states affected." This was downtown Pittsburgh on March 21, 1936. My grandfather was in a business meeting downtown and had to be evacuated by boat. Flood sweeps into Ohio Valley, death and destruction mount. And then the flooding coming down the Ohio River moved into the Mississippi River. And if that wasn't bad enough, a few weeks later during the summer of 1936 was the worst heat waves in U.S. history. The following year, 1937, brought even worse flooding to the Ohio River Valley. The water in the 1937 floods got as deep as 85 feet and nearly submerged this entire bridge. This is what Louisville, Kentucky looked like in the January 1937 flood. And then again in the following year, 1938, massive flooding struck the east once again. This is what Providence, Rhode Island looked like during the 1938 Great New England Hurricane. Here's some more pictures from the 1938 flooding in New England, the third year in a row which the eastern U.S. was hit by massive flooding. The Midwest and most of the eastern U.S. was formed by floods, and that's the reason why people settled there. Fertile soils and abundant water are the reason why people settled along the Mississippi River and Ohio River floodplains. They get floods there almost every year and have been getting floods there for many millions of years. These floods have nothing to do with carbon dioxide. When this horse was washed into the tree in 1937, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were extremely low. And it's unfortunate that writers at the New York Times are so scientifically illiterate. Knowledge of science is a very good thing. And we need this knowledge to fight the superstition and hysteria behind climate alarmism. Toto is doing his part to provide this education. Please visit him on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.